and good morning. I too would like to begin by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I'm happy to be here today with two of my favorite people and two women who just know how to get things done. My colleague, Minister Anita Anand, and one of our partners, Tabatha Bull, President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. It's a pleasure to be here with you both today. The input from the Indigenous Reference Group, which includes members such as the CCAB and the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, among others, has been critical to this work. This group was established to advise the government on an Indigenous-informed approach to the mandatory target of at least 5% procurement from Indigenous businesses. Their input has been essential for creating transformational change in Indigenous communities. The much-needed policy changes and funding that have been announced today will provide a boost for Indigenous enterprises across the country. We know, and those working within the Indigenous economy know, there is an underrepresentation of Indigenous businesses in the federal procurement process. These new changes will help businesses compete for federal contracts. To support the mandatory government-wide procurement target of at least 5%, the procurement strategy for Aboriginal businesses will be modernized. First of all, by changing the name to the Procurement Strategy for Indigenous Business to be more reflective and inclusive. In addition to that, we'll be broadening the geographical areas where federal organizations must first consider procuring with Indigenous businesses and organizations. Furthermore, we've heard the current procurement model is outdated, and that's why we're working to remove barriers that restrict growing Indigenous businesses. Recognizing the talent, innovation, and potential of Indigenous businesses by opening up the procurement process is part of a larger overall effort to close the economic gaps between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous people in Canada. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted these socioeconomic gaps. It has caused intense economic strain and uncertainty. In recognition of this, the funding today builds on investment that we committed to as part of Budget 2021. We provided economic support to Indigenous businesses and communities, such as an additional $117 million to the Indigenous Community Business Fund. We also provided funding to Indigenous women business owners to ensure they are supported. In the spring, I hosted a roundtable of Indigenous women entrepreneurs to discuss some of the challenges they faced over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic and in establishing and maintaining their businesses in a changed world. Back in February 2020, my very first meeting as a parliamentary secretary was with Tabatha Bull, and we discussed the challenges Indigenous businesses face during the procurement process. With over $35 million announced today, Indigenous Services Canada will work with Minister Anand's team to implement the policy, engage with partners, add Indigenous businesses to the directory, track mandatory reporting, and work to close that gap that I've heard from so many Indigenous businesses. It's imperative that we foster and encourage opportunities for Indigenous businesses so they can flourish and continue to be the cornerstones of their communities, like some of the women I met during the roundtable. And it is part of this government's efforts towards advancing economic reconciliation with Indigenous communities as it promotes healthy, vibrant, and prosperous communities. Our government is working towards a sustainable green economy that is inclusive of Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous women and underrepresented groups, and lifts them up. So I applaud the changes that Minister Anand announced today and extend my sincere gratitude to all involved with this work. Together, we will make the economy more open and accessible to Indigenous peoples in order to advance economic reconciliation. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.